the sense of pride that existed before Vietnam. But it cannot be achieved by refighting a war that is finished as far as America is concerned.
The war was not quite finished when President Ford spoke those words, but the end of the road was in sight. The road led south along the seacoast of Vietnam, refugees fleeing before the advancing enemy. They were joined on the road by South Vietnamese troops, no longer fighting, but running for their lives. 6 days after the president spoke, the last Americans were evacuated from Saigon, many flown by helicopter from the grounds of the American embassy. The next day, the Army of North Vietnam occupied Saigon, and the government of South Vietnam surrendered. At last, the war was over. The war was lost. The Vietnam War was supposed to have ended in 1973 with the signing of a ceasefire agreement in Paris. But for 2 years after that agreement, North and South Vietnam would accuse each other of violating its terms. And in fact, both did. The war went on, but the war was fought without American troops. The ceasefire agreement required that all remaining American forces leave Vietnam within 60 days. The ceasefire created another dramatic event in 1973, the release of prisoners of war, including almost 600 Americans. The first group of POWs was released on February 12, 1973, flown from Hanoi to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. Most were American pilots shot down over North Vietnam. For all of those aboard these planes, the flight to freedom meant the end of a nightmare. The world was watching on television as the flights arrived in the Philippines. The first ex-prisoner to emerge was Navy Captain Jeremiah Denton, who would later be elected senator from Alabama. He had been a prisoner for 7 years.
We are honored to have the opportunity to serve our country under difficult circumstances. We are profoundly grateful to our Commander-in-Chief and to our nation for this day. God bless America. God bless America.
The friends and relatives and loved ones of all these men were watching from thousands of miles away, watching from their living rooms, waiting for a familiar face to appear on their television screens. Ike Pappas described the scene in one of those homes.
Marion Purcell prayed as she waited these last few minutes, prayed as she had for 7.5 years that her husband would be brought safely home. She gathered her family around her in the early morning hours to watch for a glimpse of her husband, Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Robert Purcell, shot down in 1965 while on a mission over the North. She had received several letters from him over the years saying that he would come home someday. But it was difficult now for her to realize that it was really happening. Marion Purcell had said earlier that she was apprehensive, concerned about the future, about the reaction that her husband would have to the way the family had developed over the past 7.5 years. She even wondered whether he would like the car that she bought. Her apprehension grew as the last of the former prisoners came off the first jet from Hanoi. Her husband was not aboard. 30 minutes later, the process was repeated as the men were taken off the second plane, and Marion Purcell and her long wait ended in tears and screams of joy.
Lieutenant Colonel Purcell stepping off the door.
Hey, Purcell, that's Bob.
And soon the former prisoners were home, reunited with their families. These scenes of joy were repeated at Air Force bases across the United States. It was several weeks before the last of the prisoners were released. We reported that story from Hanoi on March 29, 1973.
The North Vietnamese turned out in greater numbers than ever before at their bomb-battered Hanoi airport today to watch the last of their American prisoners head for home. There was no apparent hostility here, but any cheers were reserved for the very last American to go of the 590 they had captured. He was Lieutenant Commander Alfred Agnew of Mullins, South Carolina, a Navy pilot. He went down on December 28th, the last day of the Christmas bombing offensive. Today, he was preceded by 66 others. These prisoners were mostly short-termers, if any time spent in a North Vietnamese cell could be called short-term. The oldest prisoner among today's group, oldest in time behind communist bars, was Air Force Captain Marion Marshall of Hyattsville, Maryland, shot down July 2nd last year. In recent weeks, at any rate, they've been held in a prison 2 miles from downtown Hanoi. The gate to the camp, called Na Tu So, was at the end of a deceptively pastoral lane off a busy street in a working-class district. On the last day of captivity, the prisoners were inspected by this ceasefire's International Control Commission, a formation outside their cells, the half-dressed men grim, unsmiling. Then, seemingly to a silent signal, they marched to their cells. One grasped my hand in passing, only to have a guard break our grip. We weren't supposed to talk with them, but we managed to sneak in a few words before guards broke it up, these with Master Sergeant James Goff of Fresno, California.
When were you shot? December 27th. December 27th. B-52? When was the first you knew about a ceasefire?
5 days after it was signed. Or after it was signed, yes.
Mm-hmm. So you had reasonable...
Pardon?
You had reasonable feeling you were going to get out pretty soon, huh?
Outside the camp, a large crowd in holiday, not unfriendly spirits, gathered to await the prisoners' departure in their camouflage buses. Their route took them past some of their own work, the bomb-damaged Long Bien Bridge, and past the destroyed railroad repair yards, and then on to the airport. As the buses stopped outside the airport, the quick, illegal conversations renewed, like questions as to who won the Super Bowl and how other teams were doing.
How are the Boston Bruins doing? Boston Bruins, how are they doing? Boston Bruins, that's not my team. I don't know.
Just great to see Americans.
It is. It's great to see you too, sir.
And then the North Vietnamese guards used their last minutes of authority to shut off the conversation again.
Those are the last known American prisoners of war. That part of the Vietnam tragedy is over. But they leave behind 1,300 others missing in action. There's not much hope that many of them survive. But now the grim search begins to try to account for everyone, if possible. But for these men, it is now the flight to freedom and on to Clark Field, the Philippines. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News, Hanoi, North Vietnam.
1973. The prisoners were home. American troops were home. And other news was crowding Vietnam into the background. The other news was called Watergate, the scandal that embroiled and ultimately destroyed the Nixon presidency. It led to Nixon's resignation in August 1974, succeeded by his vice president, Gerald Ford. But partly eclipsed by Watergate, the war was continuing in Southeast Asia. Even after the ceasefire, American planes had continued to bomb communist strongholds in Cambodia. Congress finally forced an end to the bombing in August 1973. In Vietnam itself, the war was escalating again. The communists continued to build their strength in South Vietnam, and the South continued to hammer away at communist positions. Some of those positions were controlled by local guerrilla forces. In late 1973, Ed Bradley visited the Viet Cong.
Each village we visited had its own guerrilla force, a group of men and women, some of them still really boys and girls, who were armed with modern weapons and trained to fight. Here in the Hoa Cho village, when the local leaders learned we were interested in filming guerrilla activities, they arranged a series of demonstrations. Although they scheduled this tour, everything we saw we had seen before or would see in visits to other villages. Similar scenes that were part of life and that were not staged for our benefit. The guerrillas are taught to care for and use their weapons at an early age. In many locations, we saw fully armed boys and girls only 14 or 15 years old. These Viet Cong guerrillas, or liberation fighters as they prefer to be called, served as the local police force. These guerrillas had finished their demonstration and were moving off on patrol when a government observation plane fired a rocket to mark the area for an airstrike. The villagers started for their bunkers, well-camouflaged holes in the ground. In the 2 weeks we spent with the Viet Cong, almost every house had a bunker, and most of them were built with concrete walls, reinforced with sandbags, and covered with mounds of dirt and grass. Within a few minutes, government Air Force jets were on target. Local officials pointed to this attack as an example of Saigon's violation of the Paris ceasefire accord. They told us their village was under Viet Cong control long before the ceasefire date. Yet they said almost every day since then, this area had been bombed or shelled by the big guns from nearby government artillery bases. During our 2 weeks with the Viet Cong, we saw planes on bombing runs or heard the shelling every day, and on several occasions had to scramble into bunkers in the middle of the night. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is still in operation primarily to supply Khmer insurgents in Cambodia. Since Hanoi doesn't have to worry about American bombing, supplies for South Vietnam are trucked across the so-called demilitarized zone to those areas in this country's northern provinces that are controlled by the Viet Cong. But from this point, the trail springs to life again, and men and women replace the trucks. Our Viet Cong interpreters called these people cargo carriers. They are the heart of the Viet Cong supply system. They carry food, medicine, clothing, weapons, ammunition, anything that is needed in the areas of South Vietnam controlled by the Viet Cong. Only occasionally did we see jeeps or trucks during our visit. They make easy targets for Saigon's planes or artillery bases which bomb and shell these areas. The cargo carriers can slip off the road or into a bunker. They don't burn gas or require preventive maintenance. They work only in their own districts, so they know all of the trails and many of the people. As the monsoon season swept into Binh Dinh province, we expected a halt in this human transportation system, but the swollen rivers were only minor obstacles. This supply system is slow, antiquated, and by modern standards, inefficient. It takes a long time for supplies to reach from one end of the pipeline to the other. But this archaic system provided the men and supplies to defeat the French. It withstood the years of massive American bombing. And today, the Ho Chi Minh Trail keeps a steady flow of materiel into South Vietnam. Ed Bradley, CBS News, with the Viet Cong.
By the start of 1975, it was clear that North Vietnam was on the verge of a major offensive. In January, Communist forces captured a province only 60 miles north of Saigon. In March, they attacked over here in the Central Highlands, a large mountainous area, sparsely populated, difficult to defend. The breaking point apparently came when the Communists encircled and captured the provincial capital of Banh Mi Thuot. South Vietnam's President Thieu then ordered his troops to abandon the Central Highlands and the northern provinces of South Vietnam. That was the beginning of the end. Charles Collingwood described what happened next.
The South Vietnamese forces in the area broke and fled. The civilian population was already moving out, carrying what belongings they could, snaking in a pathetic column along back roads which were still uncut by the enemy. Soldiers and civilians were intermingled, and at times they came under fire, adding to the casualties and confusion. The goal was to reach the great cities of the coast, where they thought they would find safety. They did not know then that there was no safety there, and that their flight had only begun. For already, the North Vietnamese were sweeping down the coast, driving before them new floods of refugees. Outside the legendary former imperial capital of Hue, the South Vietnamese at first put up a feeble defensive effort. But no major battle was fought for Hue. Morale broke. Some of the best troops in South Vietnam simply disintegrated as fighting units. Generals abandoned their command to colonels, colonels to majors, until there was no command, and the troops joined civilians in a panicky exodus. Bruce Dunning reported on the mass migration south.
These people are just part of the greatest flight of refugees ever to occur in Vietnam in all its years of war. Many of these people had walked all the way from Quang Tri seeking safety in Hue, only to learn that they must join the thousands of Hue residents moving farther south to Da Nang, 60 miles away. The rich can leave by plane, but like the poor, they can only take what they can carry with them. The less rich can afford a ride on a bus or a truck, but the poor must walk. Young children, the old, many are barefoot, struggling along under heavy bundles. Whole families push carts weighed down with precious belongings. Soldiers are trying to get their families out of Hue. Rockets are hitting the center of the city, making everyone aware that the North Vietnamese are not far away.
The refugees came to Da Nang by ship as well as on foot. They were crowded into the ships like sardines, and, like fish, they had to be unloaded in nets. But even as the refugees swarmed ashore in Da Nang, the word was passed that Da Nang itself would be the next place to fall. The refugees who had already come so far were joined by hundreds of thousands in Da Nang seeking to escape. Perhaps 1.5 million people in all. Panic and disorder were the rule. Ships sent to help evacuate the multitude had to lie well offshore. There was a frenzied scramble to reach them. As usual, by now, the unruly, undisciplined soldiers were in the forefront. Some managed to crowd onto small boats to cross the intervening water. Others waded out as far as they could and swam for it. Some drowned. Many were left behind.
The scenes were even worse at Da Nang's airport, where desperate Vietnamese scrambled and fought to find a way out. On March 29th, the World Airways jumbo jet flew into Da Nang to evacuate refugees. The airline president, Ed Daly, was aboard the flight, and so was CBS News correspondent Bruce Dunning.
Reports from Saigon said thousands of people were roaming Da Nang airfield. But as the plane landed, this did not at first seem evident. But then people poured from behind buildings and revetments, racing on cars, jeeps, trucks, Hondas, and on foot, desperate to get to the plane and make sure they got on before anyone else.
One guy got on.
As soon as the rear stairway was lowered, the stampede of terrorized people tried to storm the plane. From the cockpit, the pilots reported by radio that the situation was out of control. Several times the pilots moved the plane, hoping to break the crowds around the rear ladder. There was no control. High-ranking officers in Da Nang have fled, leaving soldiers and airmen to fend for themselves. The hordes tried to jam up the stairway as Daley himself tried to block the stairs. As men clambered over one another, pushing aside women and children in their panic-stricken fury, members of the air crew dragged them onto the plane, trying to fill it as fast as possible. The tension and panic intensified. The heavily armed men were menacing. They left their wives, their children, their aged parents on the runway while they forced their own way on board, a rabble of young enlisted men. CBS News cameraman Mike Marriott and soundman Mai Van Duk dared not leave the plane, aware they might not be able to get back on. One newsman was left behind as the crowd pushed him out of reach of the plane. The stewardesses dragged people on and rushed them to seats, screaming all the while, "Where are the women and children?" They piled 4, 5, and 6 men into seats intended for 3. Finally, there was room for no more. The plane began to move as people still clambered up the ladder. Angry men left behind fired pistols and automatic weapons at the plane, determined that no one would go if they couldn't. A grenade went off under one wing, damaging it. Unable to move on the blockaded runway, the plane raced down the taxiway, swerving to avoid abandoned vehicles, perhaps even running over people. As the plane strained laboriously into the air, people were still clinging to the wheels and the rear stairs. 7 men fell off as the plane reached heights of 1,000 feet or more. As the plane reached 6,000 feet, 1 man was still stuck in the ladder. Daley had to climb out and pull him back as the plane swerved and shuddered under its heavy load. As calm fell on the smug men who had managed to fight off their friends and relatives to get on, the hard-working cabin crew took account. 268 people were on board, among them 5 women and 2 or 3 small children. The rest were some of the men whom President Thieu said would defend Da Nang. They had no apparent feelings about leaving others behind, only gratitude that World Airways had saved their lives, with a flight that Ed Daley intended for refugee women and children. Once in flight at low altitude, because the damaged rear stairway wouldn't close, the pilots assessed the damage to the plane. Bullets had damaged gas lines and the plane was losing fuel. The pilots were not sure the wheels would function on landing because people had attempted to hide in the wheel wells. The flight from Da Nang to Saigon normally takes about 50 minutes. This one took more than an hour and a half. Another World Airways plane flew alongside trying to assess the damage and reported that the cargo hatches were open and full of people.
Do you think the nose gear will come down, or you can't tell yet?
Can't tell, and I don't want to check it till we get in closer. That's the biggest problem I see at the moment here.
Long 945, clear to Saigon. Something hanging down in my gear doors. It may be a body.
Did you say a body?
Well, I can't tell. It sure looks like it.
Could be. We had them climbing all over him.
One man on the escort plane said that crew was praying for us on the damaged plane. Not knowing whether the wheel assemblies would hold, the flight crew put the plane, almost empty of fuel, down very gingerly on the runway at Saigon, and the deserters on board cheered. As the plane taxied to a parking place, soldiers poured out of the luggage holds. As cameraman Marriott was filming the unloading, a South Vietnamese Air Force security officer arrested him for taking these pictures. The Air Force had things under control again. But the men and women of World Airways had brought their plane and its load home. Bruce Denning, CBS News, back from Da Nang.
On Easter Sunday, Da Nang fell to the North Vietnamese, once again without a fight. The horde of refugees pressed on south before the advance of the feared North Vietnamese. They were making now for the port cities of Quy Nhon and Nha Trang. But even as the flood of homeless civilians and leaderless troops rolled on, Quy Nhon was surrounded and Nha Trang was being evacuated. As battered cargo ships brought their thousands of demoralized civilians and soldiers into Nha Trang, tens of thousands more were trying to get out. But there were some who would never get farther than Nha Trang. The people on this uncovered open barge had spent 3 days at sea escaping from Da Nang. Exposed to the elements, without water, without food, more than 100 on this barge died. Most of them were children. For those who got as far as Nha Trang and were not too exhausted to continue their escape, the next stopping place was Cam Ranh. Cam Ranh Bay is one of the great deep-water ports of the world, developed into a major installation by the Americans, well protected from assault. But like other strongholds up and down the coast, Cam Ranh was evacuated without a struggle. Ironically, the South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians were running away faster than the North Vietnamese were advancing. Days after radio contact with Nha Trang and Cam Ranh had ceased, the North Vietnamese hadn't even got around to occupying them. The domino theory had come to Vietnam with a vengeance. As province after province, city after city, toppled not through enemy action, but through the contagion of collapse.
Countless thousands of refugees had traveled huge distances, only to find they would have to travel again. There was no safety at the end of the road. For many, the journey ended at Vung Tau, on the coast not far from Saigon. And what the refugees found most often was heartbreak and misery. Bob Simon reported.
This is the end of the refugee trail, Vung Tau, the fashionable coastal resort 2 hours from Saigon, with people arriving every day courtesy of the Navy. This ship sailed from Cam Ranh Bay 4 days ago. Its cargo, 20,000 human beings. There was no food on board, very little water. Many people died, no one knows how many. The corpses were thrown overboard. The ship sailed from Cam Ranh, but the people are from Quang Tri, Hue, Kon Tum, Pleiku, Da Nang, Quy Nhon, Nha Trang. All those names, all those places abandoned by the government and the army of South Vietnam. Saigon says people fled to escape communist rule. Hanoi says it was because of American and South Vietnamese propaganda. But that's not what the people say. People say it was not politics, not propaganda, it was panic. They left their homes because everyone else was leaving, the soldiers, the civil servants, their neighbors. The fear was contagious, overpowering. The No family left Kon Tum in a truck. Near Quy Nhon, the communists shelled the road. No Tan Hue, 25 years old, a teacher, was badly wounded. He'd been leading the family, making the decisions. When they got to Quy Nhon, they saw that people weren't stopping, so they continued. When they got to Da Nang, they saw government troops running wild, so they continued. When they got to Cam Ranh, they scrambled onto fishing boats to get to this ship. When they got on board, No Tan Hue realized his mother, 2 sisters, and 2 brothers were missing. There was nothing he could do. No Tan Hue is treated for his wounds and taken away in an ambulance. The rest of the family will have to continue without him. His father, a potato farmer, is now in charge. They're ordered to get out of the naval base onto the road. A truck will take them to a refugee camp. They wait 2 hours, but no trucks come. Finally, they're told there are no trucks because the refugee camp is full. What the No family missed by not getting into the camp was the company of 100,000 people, some order, a little food, and a large military presence. The soldiers are not here to prevent the North Vietnamese from getting in. They're here to prevent the refugees from getting out. Saigon doesn't want them around. The No family doesn't know what to do. A man with a lambretta offers to take them to a nearby Catholic mission for 1,000 piastres. People are still making money from this war. It may be their last chance. The family only has 5,000 piastres, but they take the gamble. It doesn't pay off. The gates of the mission are locked. The priests tell them to go away. There's no more room. Another lambretta driver, another 1,000 piastre demand, another decision. But they have no choice. This trip takes them to a soccer stadium. It will be their last trip for the day, probably for several days, maybe for a lot longer. A man from Hue shows them pictures of his family, the family he hasn't seen in 10 days. He wants to know if the No family has come across them. They explain that they're from Khartoum, not Hue, that they've taken a different route, but the man doesn't understand. An official tells them there's no food, no facilities in the stadium, but assures them it's only temporary. They'll be moving on very soon. It's not the first promise they've heard from a government official. But what they really want to know is whether No Tan Hue, when he's released from the hospital, will ever find them. What they really want to know is whether his mother, 2 sisters, and 2 brothers, drowned in Cam Ranh, are trapped there, or made it onto another ship. They may never find out. Bob Simon, CBS News, Vung Tau.
There seemed to be no limits to the tragedy unfolding in Vietnam. On April 4th, a plane load of orphans took off from Saigon. It crashed a short time later. Our reporter was Murray Frompson.
The orphans airlift was considered a victory over red tape. It took an order from President Ford to dispatch the C-5A to Saigon. Then the agreement of Vietnamese authorities to expedite passports and exit visas for the orphans. Some of those put aboard the plane had been born only weeks ago. Most seemed to be between the ages of 2 and 8. Some sat along the side of the plane. Others were strapped to the floor, more terrified of the television lights than their first trip in an airplane. Wives of American officials being evacuated home with their own children agreed to act as chaperones to the orphans. Destination, the West Coast, and then onward to American families who had already begun the adoption process.
2 hours ago, I watched this airplane take off from Tan Son Nhut Air Base. It was a perfect takeoff, carrying those orphans to the United States. What can one say except, when will the misery in this country ever stop?
The huge plane crashed into a field about 5 miles from the end of the runway, near a small village in Gia Dinh province. There were pieces of wreckage scattered across a half a mile of rice paddy. A fire was slowly burning itself out near the engines. Smashed bodies or parts of them were uncovered by Vietnamese Air Force crews and American officials who rushed to the scene. It was like a combat operation. Helicopters hovered overhead. Body bags were used to remove corpses for identification purposes. Scores of ambulances rushed survivors to a nearby hospital. Some of the chaperones were in a state of shock. Moments before, they had been happy to be leaving Saigon. The orphans were to be the first of 2,000 to be airlifted out of Vietnam. Many were mixed blood, the children of Vietnamese women and black American GIs. They would never have had a chance for happiness in Vietnam, where racial prejudice is as strong as in any other country. Now, they have no chance at all. Murray Frompson, CBS News, in Gia Dinh province.
The enemy was moving ever closer to Saigon, but hope remained that somehow the communist advance could be stopped. A number of South Vietnamese units remained intact, but were handicapped by a shortage of air support. South Vietnam had an air force, but did not have the resources to keep the planes repaired. One of the key defense points was Tay Ninh, only 55 miles from Saigon. Bob Simon reported.
Just outside Tay Ninh, a 105mm howitzer lets the North Vietnamese know they may have a fight on their hands. Tanks race up from Saigon, deploying along Route 22, a road which the communists have cut several times this week. Regional forces now comb the rice paddies and hamlets every morning to keep the road open. There's artillery, there's air support. But of 800 planes operational 2 years ago, less than 250 are now flying. Of these, less than 150 are fighter planes. Air support for the Tay Ninh region is being supplied from the sprawling base at Bien Hoa, 20 miles from Saigon. The pilots are flying at least 2 missions a day. Morale seems to be high. Perhaps it's because these men are doing what they've always done, what they've been trained to do. They've not experienced the panic and humiliation of the soldiers who were told to retreat when they knew their job was to fight. The main force at Bien Hoa consists of some 75 F-5 fighter bombers. Another 20 here are grounded due to lack of spare parts. An American maintenance advisor told us it's not that the spare parts aren't available, there are plenty stacked in warehouses around Saigon. But the South Vietnamese never made a proper inventory, he said. No one knows where to look. On the ground, the Tay Ninh district is being defended by the 25th Division. The men still smile for the cameras, but will they stand and fight? The 25th has never been one of South Vietnam's best. Morale is not high. Many men speak of their relatives trapped in Da Nang and Quy Nhon. The officers don't know what to expect from Saigon. The men can't know what to expect from their officers. Can anything be done? A change of leadership in Saigon might help, but one officer said what's really needed is the sight of American B-52s and Phantoms flying overhead. Many soldiers here still expect to see them any day. No matter what they read in newspapers, no matter what they hear on the radio, they simply cannot believe that the great nation which virtually created their country would ever leave them entirely on their own. Just outside Saigon, embankments are going up. They're being called tank barriers, but they could never stop North Vietnamese tanks, and they're not meant to. They're works of art, fragile symbols of Saigon's will to survive. Even closer to the capital, men, boys rather, 17 years old, are being inducted into the army. It might all be over before they get a chance to fight or to run. On another road to Saigon, the road from Vung Tau, the port where shiploads of refugees unload every day, police roadblocks have been set up. Only people who can prove their Saigon residence are permitted through. The police hope to prevent communist sappers from infiltrating the city. They also want to make sure Saigon doesn't become another Da Nang, flooded with refugees who made the city indefensible before the communists had even arrived. Soldiers, in uniform or out, are handed over to the military police. According to the government, they will be regrouped, rearmed, redeployed. Whether these men, after what they've been through, have any fight left in them is a very open question. And even if Saigon could make use of every survivor of the 5 divisions which disintegrated this past month, it still could not match the number of troops which North Vietnam could muster for a final attack.
The military situation was getting worse every day. American leaders were now convinced that South Vietnam could not be saved without additional aid. President Ford requested that aid, but Congress refused to provide it.
It's a tragedy unbelievable in its ramifications. I must say that I'm frustrated by the action of the Congress in not responding to some of the requests, both for economic, humanitarian, and military assistance in South Vietnam.
Secretary of State Kissinger echoed that argument.
And what we face now is whether the United States not just will withdraw its forces, which we achieved, and not just will stop the end of the loss of American lives, but whether it will deliberately destroy an ally by withholding aid from it in its moment of extremity.
Many in Congress felt it was too late for aid to accomplish much, and they had no desire to invest any further in a lost cause. The aid was not provided, and any slim hopes of turning the tide disappeared. But South Vietnam was not the first nation to fall in Southeast Asia. That fate belonged to Cambodia, where communist insurgents known as the Khmer Rouge were closing in on the capital city, Phnom Penh. Again, a sudden dramatic collapse was in progress. How had Cambodia reached this point? Charles Collingwood explained.
For years, while the war in Vietnam mounted in intensity next door, Cambodia seemed to lead a charmed life. Its capital city of Phnom Penh was gracious and uncluttered, unmarked by war. Cambodia's primitive agriculture ensured that no one was really hungry. The ancient rituals were undisturbed. That this was so was largely due to the machinations of Cambodia's colorful and exotic ruler, Prince Sihanouk. He was able to maintain an equilibrium between the rival attentions of the North and South Vietnamese, Americans, Russians, and Chinese, and dissidents within his own kingdom. Sihanouk had to give a little here and there, a border sanctuary to the North Vietnamese, a blind eye turned toward American bombings thereof, but for a long time he kept Cambodia unscathed. It was too good to last. In 1970, Sihanouk took a vacation in Europe. In his absence, he was promptly overthrown by his anti-communist Prime Minister, General Lon Nol, who appealed to the United States for help. It was not long in forthcoming. On April 30th, 1970, President Nixon announced that 70,000 American and South Vietnamese troops had entered Cambodia to wipe out the communist sanctuaries there. The so-called incursion accomplished little, but from that time on, not only was Cambodia in the war, but its fate was sealed. As usual at the beginning of a war, what passed for the martial spirit in Cambodia at first ran high. Youngsters enlisted, uniforms were popular, haphazard training was undertaken beneath the eyes of American advisors. Haphazard fighting followed. The anti-government factions quickly raised their own forces, trained and indoctrinated by the North Vietnamese. The war in Cambodia became a civil war, Cambodian fighting Cambodian. Every year the war dragged on, Cambodia became more like its neighbor. Its villages in ruins, its people turned into refugees, dependent on others for food and for medical care. Its cities terrorized by rockets from nowhere. The dead were everywhere. The United States invested $1.5 billion in Cambodia's defense, but nothing was enough to stem the insurgents' advance. As the end neared, only a few major population centers could be garrisoned by government troops. The perimeter around Phnom Penh had so shrunk that even the airlift of essential supplies was constantly interrupted by rebel fire. Nor did the firing stop when Lon Nol, after clinging to power for 5 years, said a tearful farewell and left for Indonesia and America. Cambodia was dragged into the war only in 1970, and it took no more than 5 years to reach the end of the road.
The road in Cambodia led to Phnom Penh. The fighting raged closer and closer to the capital. Ed Bradley was among the reporters covering the last days of Cambodia.
Death came when they least expected it. 2 soldiers took a break by the side of a road, far enough behind the so-called front lines that, for the moment, they felt secure. But at that same moment, a Khmer Rouge gunner changed the coordinates on his captured American-made 105 artillery piece. 1 shell, 2 dead, their bodies ripped apart by the blast. Morm Varek was luckier. He narrowly escaped death, but never before had the war and the killing left him so dazed. He was walking through the field with his sergeant. They were born within a year of each other and grew up in the same village. From childhood, they were best friends, and since the start of this war had served in the same unit. The sergeant was looking for a place to relieve himself when he stepped on a mine. Varek, who was walking next to him, caught shrapnel under both eyes. He picked up the body of his friend and placed it in a bunker. His leg had been blown away, and there seemed to be no life left in his body. Varek walked out looking for help. More than 3 hours later, Chun Ben is carried out, still alive. All of this takes place just 10 miles from Phnom Penh. Yet there were no helicopters to evacuate his friend, no blood to give him a transfusion, no morphine to deaden the excruciating pain, no medicine to prevent shock, not even a roll of gauze to bind the stump that is left of his leg. More than 3 hours after he stepped on a mine, Chun Ben is still alive. He's taken to the command post where his papers are checked. And as a crowd gathers at the open window, he still receives no medication, no blood transfusion. His leg is wrapped in gauze as life continues to ebb. 4 hours after he stepped on that mine, Chun Ben is back in the ambulance, now racing towards Phnom Penh and the 401 hospital. There is still life left in his body, but a good deal of his blood has spilled to the ground. Morm Varek couldn't come to the hospital with his friend. His wounds were considered light, so they were cleaned in the field and he was sent back to his unit. So he wasn't here when his best friend finally received medication and a blood transfusion. And he wasn't here to see his friend's body fight against the pain. And he wasn't here to see Chun Ben die.
Americans were leaving Cambodia now, contractors, relief workers, much of the U.S. Embassy payroll, getting out while they still could. On April 12th, the last Americans left Phnom Penh. Again, a report from Ed Bradley.
The American embassy was tense. Marine guards in civilian clothes, armed with M16s, stood behind a closed and locked gate. The rumors and speculation of the last several days had become fact. The Americans were leaving. The decision had been made to evacuate the American embassy and all its personnel, including a number of Cambodians and their families who had worked for the embassy, as well as some high Cambodian officials. Flatbed trucks were loaded behind the embassy as a few remaining American officials secured the area prior to their own departure. The trucks were then taken to an area that had been secured by some 350 U.S. Marines flown in from the Okinawa and Hancock, cruising on station in the Gulf of Thailand. The evacuation of Phnom Penh was carried off with the memory of recent evacuations in Vietnam. There was an overpowering fear among American officials, both in Phnom Penh and in Washington, that this evacuation would cause panic in the streets and possibly a rash of anti-American sentiment. With that in mind, the Marines established a perimeter around the landing zone. But there was no real need for soldiers or weapons, as the only crowds that gathered were for the most part smiling and waving children drawn by curiosity. The CH-53 helicopters lifted off from Phnom Penh, headed for the Gulf of Thailand, ending still another phase in the American involvement in Indochina. In a matter of hours, it was all over. The American presence in Cambodia ended with the liftoff of Ambassador Dean and his party. But the official announcement, heard aboard ship, provided the period to the ending. There were the familiar notes of the boatswain's pipes, and then these words, announcing the arrival on board of the American Embassy, Phnom Penh. Ed Bradley, CBS News, aboard the USS Okinawa.
4 days later, Cambodia fell to the Khmer Rouge. What followed was a bloodbath. The communists evacuated the cities, and in the next 3 years killed more than 1 million persons. But even as Phnom Penh was falling, communist troops in Vietnam were advancing toward Saigon. The panic that had swept down the coast was at large now in the city streets. Thousands of desperate Vietnamese trying to find a way out. Bill Plant reported.
By 8 this morning, there were 1,500 lined up outside the embassy. They, too, are a part of the U.S. legacy in Vietnam. The American role as protector is about to end, and some of those who once felt safe are now filled with fear. Their faces tell more than words: hope, despair, resignation. They clutched documents, telegrams or letters from relatives in the States, financial guarantees. At midday, there is still a small crowd at the gate to the U.S. consulate. Some are waiting for a letter or telegram of sponsorship from the States. Others grasp for any way out. They gather around any American who ventures near. 3 years ago, a woman says, I worked for a U.S. company in Vietnam. Can I get out? Can you sponsor me, asks another. It is painful to have to tell them that there is nothing you can do.
Some Vietnamese found it easier to leave the country. President Thieu resigned on April 21st and 4 days later flew to safety in Taiwan. By this time, enemy troops were only 35 miles from Saigon. The United States mission in Vietnam had prepared emergency plans to evacuate American citizens. Ambassador Graham Martin had delayed implementing those plans, hoping the situation could still be improved. But by April 29th, North Vietnamese rockets were falling on Saigon's airport, and time was running out. The order was given to begin the largest helicopter evacuation in history. More than 1,000 Americans and almost 6,000 Vietnamese were flown to U.S. Navy ships offshore. Countless thousands of Vietnamese who wanted to leave the country were left behind. Some found other ways out. Most did not. We have two reports from Peter Collins and Ed Bradley.
The sky over Saigon was filled with dozens of assorted aircraft, helicopters, transports, even fighter bombers in a nameless whirling merry-go-round over the city. U.S. Embassy helicopters flew from roof to roof, plucking up stranded Americans and occasionally depositing them on the landing pad atop the embassy. But from the roof of the Caravel Hotel in downtown Saigon, it looked as though every pilot in the South Vietnamese Air Force who could get his hands on an aircraft had decided that now was the time to get away. It was mid-morning when the word came. A full-scale emergency evacuation had been ordered. All Americans were to report immediately to assembly points designated weeks in advance. When buses arrived at the assembly points, they were soon jammed with anxious Americans and some Vietnamese who slipped aboard. Then came a hair-raising ride to the airport. American Marines brought in to guard the helicopter landing zone stayed close to bunkers as the steady thump of rockets and the clatter of small arms kept up throughout the day. The landing zone was the parking lot of what used to be the American military headquarters in Vietnam, once known as Pentagon East. But now the huge building was a last-ditch holding area, while overhead big Air Force and Marine helicopters arrived to land at intervals of about 5 minutes. Inside the building, the evacuees were broken into groups of 50, and then it was a mad dash out the door into the parking lot for the waiting helicopter. Although it seemed much longer, it took only 2 or 3 minutes to load the helicopters, and then it was farewell to Vietnam. To avoid the threat of surface-to-air missiles, the big chopper skimmed low over Saigon, with the door gunner at the ready and the engines deliberately set to produce a stream of white smoke so that anti-aircraft crews would have a hard time spotting it. It was a 45-minute ride from the encircled and threatened city of Saigon to the safety of American aircraft carriers waiting offshore. On the midway, the refugees are led quickly away from the howling blast of the helicopters by Navy crewmen. For them, it is only the first leg in a journey away from Vietnam and the war, but perhaps an uncertain future in America. Peter Collins, CBS News, with the final American withdrawal from Vietnam.
It's going to be uncomfortable, but it's a ride.
The crowds of Americans and other foreigners lined up at installations around Saigon waiting for buses was the cue. It told the Vietnamese that this was the end of the line. For most of those who wanted to leave their country, this would be their last chance. Some Americans who pushed towards the bus tried to pull their Vietnamese wives and children along with them. There were desperate scenes with families separated and crying out for help, pleading not to be left behind, clutching at the last straw of hope. We rode through the streets of Saigon for more than 4 hours, unable to find a way out or anyone who could tell us where to go. At Tan Son Nhut Airport, armed paratroopers turned our buses back. At one point, we were unloaded on the Saigon waterfront, where we could see American helicopters circling the city, and Vietnamese trying to escape on boats heading to the sea. No one wanted to be left in this crowd that at times was strangely quiet, but that always was on the verge of panic. We all decided to try and reach the United States Embassy, and once there, we found it surrounded by Vietnamese looking for a way in and a way out. Helicopters were landing on the roof and inside the compound as we walked to the back of the embassy. We had to push and shove our way through a crowd of several hundred Vietnamese trying to scale the walls, only to be knocked back by U.S. Marines. Once inside the compound, for the Americans and those Vietnamese who managed to get in with legal documents, and the many who managed entrance without, the rest was easy. It was just a matter matter of waiting your turn for a helicopter to take you to one of the ships on station off the Vietnamese coast. The American fleet had been having problems since the start of the evacuation with the arrival of South Vietnamese pilots and their helicopters loaded with family and friends. Hovering above the decks to unload their passengers, the pilots were unfamiliar with landing their craft on a moving ship. One crashed into the side of the USS Blue Ridge. Others managed to crash land on the deck of the ship. For those that did manage to put down, they were simply pushed over the side and into the sea by U.S. sailors and Marines to make room for the returning American craft based on that ship, filled with evacuees from Saigon. Other South Vietnamese pilots just hovered long enough to unload their passengers and then headed to the side of the ships and just jumped out with their life vests to be picked up by U.S. sailors, their helicopters crashing into the sea. Still other pilots headed out to the side of the ships after unloading their passengers and settled the craft into the water and then jumped out, again waiting to be picked up by U.S. sailors. Many hours later, as one of the last evacuees arrived, U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin, the final American ambassador stationed in South Vietnam. After so many long and bitter years, the American involvement in Vietnam was over.
The next day, April 30th, 1975, communist troops moved into Saigon. They met very little resistance. That same day, the government of South Vietnam surrendered. In the central plaza of Saigon was a giant statue of two soldiers honoring South Vietnamese fighting men. What happened to the statue was symbolic of what happened to the war. It had been 21 long years since the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, 10 years since the arrival of the first American combat troops. We had poured men and money and material into Vietnam, and in the end, all of it, the bombers and helicopters, tanks and warships, the field hospitals and body bags, in the end, all of that was not enough. It was at last, as President Ford had described it, a war that is finished. This is Walter Cronkite, and this has been another in our continuing series of video cassettes on the Vietnam War.
Việt Nam ơi, thời gian quá nửa đời người và ta đã tỏ tường rồi. Ôi cuộc đời ngày sau tàn lửa khói, mẹ Việt Nam đau từng cơn xót dạ nhìn đời. Người lầm than đói khổ nghèo nàn, kẻ quyền uy giàu sang dối. Giờ đây Việt Nam còn hay đã mất, bão giặc tàu ngang tàn trên quê hương ta. Hoàng Trường Sa đã bao người dân vô tội chết ngập ngùi vì tay súng giặc tàu. Sông núi từng đoàn người đi chẳng nề chi, già trẻ gái trai giơ cao tay chống quân xâm lược, chống kẻ nhũ nhược ban nước Việt Nam. Việt Nam sau tàn lửa khói. Mẹ Việt Nam đau từng cơn xót dạ nhìn đời, người lầm than đói khổ nghèo nàn, kẻ quyền uy giàu sang dối gian. Giờ đây Việt Nam còn hay đã mất, bão giặc tàu ngang tàn trên quê hương ta. Hoàng Trường Sa đã bao người dân vô tội chết ngậm ngùi vì tay súng giặc tàu. Là một người con dân Việt Nam, lòng nào làm ngơ trước ngoài sông, người người cùng nhau đứng lên đáp lời sông núi. Từng đoàn người đi chẳng nề chi, già trẻ gái trai giơ cao tay, trong quân xâm lược, trong kẻ nhu nhược ban nước Việt Nam. Xin hỏi anh là ai? Sao bắt tôi làm điều gì sai? Xin hỏi anh là ai? Sao đánh tôi chẳng một chút nương tay? Xin hỏi anh là ai? Không cho tôi xuống đường để tỏ bày tình yêu quê hương này, dân tộc này đã có nhiều đắng cay. Xin hỏi anh ở đâu, ngăn bước tôi trong giặc tàu ngoại xâm? Xin hỏi anh ở đâu, sao mắng tôi bằng giọng nói dân tôi? Dân tộc anh ở đâu, sao đang tâm làm tay sai cho tàu? Để ngàn sau ghi dấu, bàn tay nào nhuộm đầy máu đồng bào. Tôi không thể ngồi yên khi nước Việt Nam đang ngã nghiêng, dân tộc tôi sắp phải đắm chìm 1000 năm hay triền miên tăm tối. Tôi không thể ngồi yên để đời sau cháu con tôi làm người. Cội nguồn ở đâu khi thế giới này đã không còn Việt Nam? Xin hỏi anh là ai? Sao bắt tôi làm điều gì sai? Xin hỏi anh là ai? Sao đánh tôi chẳng một chút nương tay? Xin hỏi anh là ai? Không cho tôi xuống đường để tỏ bày tình yêu quê hương này, dân tộc này đã quá nhiều đắng cay. Xin hỏi anh ở đâu, ngăn bước tôi chống giặc tàu ngoại xâm? Xin hỏi anh ở đâu, sao mắng tôi bằng giọng nói dân tôi? Dân tộc anh ở đâu, sao đang tâm làm tay sai cho tàu? Để ngàn sau ghi dấu, bàn tay nào nhuộm đầy máu đồng bào. Tôi không thể ngồi yên khi nước Việt Nam đang ngã nghiêng, dân tộc tôi sắp phải đắm chìm 1000 năm hay triền miên tăm tối. Tôi không thể ngồi yên để đời sau cháu con tôi làm người. Cội nguồn ở đâu khi thế giới này đã không còn Việt Việt Nam. Tôi không thể ngồi yên để đời sao trái